there is at the stem of angst almost this longing for justice in society, to whatever justice is. And that might be one of the problems, is that we're longing for things which we cannot define. And perhaps an example of this could potentially be identity politics. I'm not going to go too far into it, but it's almost the idea of let us try to defend or define or look towards, strive towards things which we genuinely don't know much about. And that might be things that is the cause of angst. We desire the law greatly, but we don't even know what the law is that we're desiring. We desire to protect certain rights of people, but we don't really know what the rights of those people are. What even is, I suppose, certain ideas in society, like women's rights. What is a woman, I suppose, and all these. Hello and welcome to this video. Today we are joined by Laurence to talk about the concept of dread, angst, or however you want to translate this book. There's been a few translations coming out, but today we're going to be talking about angst in this Existential Talks podcast series. Laurence, how are you?
I'm all right today. Just finished an exam.
That's nice. Sounds good. I just came back from a football match as well, so I suppose we were both somewhat mentally exhausted, but I think it's good enough to talk about Kierkegaard. At the end of the day, we both love Kierkegaard, and talk about Kierkegaard is always a good way to brighten up the mood of one's afternoon. So let's get started off with the biggest question. How would you understand or approach the idea of angst in Kierkegaard's works?
I think first, before we start talking about angst, anxiety, or dread, as you know, whatever you call it, we must first talk about freedom. And this is something which I also would like to begin to say that it's not just limited to Kierkegaard here, this idea of freedom. What it means to be able to make a radical choice in your life is something he talks about in either or. But here, he's using the example of Adam and Eve, and he's using the idea of original sin as the ability to explain what it means. He's using these things to show that freedom is the thing which presupposes our idea of angst and anxiety, and that this will presuppose what happens with sin and what happens with in Genesis 2 in the fall.
I think that's a very interesting idea and a very interesting approach to angst, because when you're thinking about Kierkegaard's works, one of the most interesting things is he starts off from the fall. And I think starting off from the fall is a very interesting thing when it approaches anything related to philosophy, or at least existentialism, is that its anthropological approach is placed as in the center of it. And I think that is very clear when you're thinking about, well, for example, Feuerbach, he talks about anthropology being perhaps the first form of understanding about God. And in the same way, I think a lot of times understanding phenomenology is about understanding a form of anthropology as well. So I think pointing out freedom and pointing out Kierkegaard's approach is definitely a very important thing. So how would you conceptualize freedom in regards to Kierkegaard? What is the type of freedom that is being pronounced? Because of course, there's a lot of different types of freedoms throughout history. What would you say is Kierkegaard's freedom?
I think for Kierkegaard, freedom is about choice. It's about being able to, and it's not like any old choice, like I could choose to like have an oasis or have an arena or whatever. But for Kierkegaard, in regards to anxiety, it's a choice which causes you to radically change something about your life. So I think even before talking about cause of anxiety, we can consider what he's trying to discuss in either or, where he's reflecting upon his most infamous breakup with Regina Elson, right? How that sort of choice to reject that normal pathway for a man in his position to become preacher in some random parish in the north of Denmark, and to just live a humble life with his wife. But rather, he made a radical choice to do the opposite. And in that moment, right, so we have this notion of moments and immediacy, right? In that moment, that's when anxiety, angst, and dread truly fills a human being. And it can be in sort of a whole plethora of situations, like we might say this uncertainty about whether I'm going to live after I die or not, this uncertainty about what am I going to do tomorrow, or this uncertainty about what happens if I don't exist? Do I exist? That sort of philosophical anxiety. But I think the primary thing he's talking about with anxiety here, in general, before we start to emphasize the existential part, is this feeling that comes with this radical choice that could change something about your life.
I think that's definitely a part of it, because there's this emphasis of the angst, or the dread in my translation, of the person, of Adam before the fall, before the knowledge of good and evil. And there's almost this overwhelming sense of dread when you're faced in relation to the potential, or at least the opportunity to make a choice. And freedom is, as a result, at the very core of, I would say, Kierkegaard's philosophy, and in extension, some of the philosophies of fellow existentialist thinkers in multiple traditions. For example, freedom in Dostoevsky is always presented as a dialectic. There's the dialectic of there being no freedom, a la the Grand Inquisitor, and then there's also the dialectic, the other side of it, of there being too much freedom in Demons, where you have, with boundless freedom becomes boundless tyranny. And as a result, freedom definitely does create a form of dialectical spirit within the works of Dostoevsky. Berdyaev, the same freedom is seen as fundamental and outright at the core of human existence. Yet at the same time, it's the way one wrestles with freedom is, of course, a very kind of complex idea. So the idea of freedom that we're pointing out, I suppose, is one which Kierkegaard does note, and is something that is a very good place to start off with when we are thinking about Kierkegaard's idea of dread. Is there anything you'd like to add to that?
I would like to ask a question about this specific line in Kierkegaard's work. Anxiety is a sympathetic antipathy and an antipathetic sympathy. What do you think Kierkegaard means by that? I think it's related to the idea of dialectic you just presented there.
Well, I'm not sure whether it's the same translation in my book. Which section do you find it under?
It's in section 5, Concepts of Anxiety.
I think one of the interesting things when you're thinking about this sentence is almost the idea that dread is a feeling which keeps you within two modes of being, in the same way that he talks a lot about how humans are a dialectic of what's the right word? I think I have in my notes. Humans are the dialectic of where is it? Is a synthesis of the soulish and the bodily. And in the same way, and the synthesis of the two is the spirit. And in the same way, I think dread is fundamentally the synthesis of antipathy and sympathy. As a result, when you're thinking about the sentence, dread is a sympathetic antipathy and an antipathetic sympathy, what is being presented is that the concept of dread comes precisely when you're trying to experience the human condition, both as a human and as a rational agent. And when I mean human, I'm not saying a human as in a specific kind of individual or what it means to be in the world, but what I mean is the emotional side of what it means to be a human, the experience that one person has. And when one gets those two ideas put together and lived out to the extreme, you get dread as a fundamental reality which comes out of the fundamental choice of whether or not you're meant to act rationally or act emotionally. And that choice is something which people wrestle with frequently. And I say that's how I would potentially approach that phrase.
I would agree. I would agree with that sort of analysis, I think. Because I was reading a bit of scholarship around this, and it was basically centered around Kierkegaard's trying to explain what he means by the dialectic. And if we keep in mind Kierkegaard's sort of odd relationship to Hegel, there could be one reading which says that this is actually a sort of mocking of Hegelian dialectics, as using these big words to explain something which seems to be quite simple. But at the same time, I think he's trying to take this quite seriously here. This sympathetic antipathy where you're in a state of caring for another but also not caring, and a state of not caring but also caring. It seems to be this sort of paradox which exists within your mind that's really found in a lot of what he's trying to describe here in existential anxiety.
Perhaps developing on from the idea, let's perhaps think a bit about his idea of the human condition, perhaps, of humans being that synthesis of the bodily and the soul. How do you take that idea and its synthesis into the spirit? What's your thoughts on that idea and that presentation of human?
I think that's a very interesting idea there, because like it sort of shifts our notion of identity away from this sort of classical ideas that we're thinking about now, psychological continuity or bodily continuity or whatever you'd like to call that continuity, but rather it is more dynamic, right? You can be in a state where you're more towards the sort of soul part, more towards the more bodily part. He talks a lot about this in Despair, in Sickness Unto Death, right?
Mm-hmm.
But in Concept of Anxiety, he hasn't fully developed that yet. So I think what's happening here is that whereas in Sickness Unto Death, I think he's considering the whole thing in a more holistic sense, right? He's got the dialectic in mind, and Anticlimacus has the ability to do it. But this author that we're presented here, Virgilius Hoffniensis, he's much more limited in his approach. He accepts and is rather upfront about his own sort of inadequacy at knowing what's happening here. But what he does know is that he's well aware of what it means to be anxious. And I think we have to distinguish here between the moment and the overall thing that's happening within human anthropology. And I think what's happening here is that Virgilius Hoffniensis is analyzing the human nature from the moment, the sort of precipice of the cliff, where one could fall off or one could stay up. And in both situations, you feel that absolute dread. Once again, we're reminded of either or. Like, kill yourself, do not kill yourself, you'll regret both. This is the essence of philosophy. In many ways, I think Virgilius Hoffniensis is really trying to tackle that problem that the young man from Either Or tried to present as a question. He's trying to answer that quite directly through a moment analysis of what it means to make a choice, and the choice that Adam and Eve had to make in the garden, whether to sin or not to sin, to disobey God or follow God. And this is in that moment that we find anxiety in its fullest and most horrific even status.
I think that's a very interesting point, and the fact that you raise Adam and Eve is something that I want to touch on a bit more, because of course the fall is something which is very key throughout the works of the concept of dread, especially at the start. And of course his references to the Old Testament doesn't only raise, or Kierkegaard's usage of the Old Testament doesn't only is not only found in the concept of dread, but also found at a core part of Fear and Trembling in other works as well. For example, the Abrahamic sacrifice of Isaac and those other ideas. And what I think is very interesting about the idea of Adam and Eve is the role of perhaps kind of a non-orthodox presentation of the fall. So instead of presenting the fall as some form of perhaps original sin, which is passed down via generations and almost via the traditional conception of it was via the sperm or whatnot, that the sin was passed down almost biologically. Of course, that's not really how it's presented, but at least conceptually, that's kind of how it moved down from one person to the other, to the next generation, to the next generation. What Kierkegaard is kind of saying when it comes to the fall is almost that each individual is a race and at the same time is himself. And as a result, the way that each of us fall and each of us sin represent perhaps symbolism or the structure of the sin found in Adam. So as a result, we all bring that original sin into the world. We all bring that fall into the world when we sin for the first time. And as a result, Adam is the structure, the archetype of all consecutive sins. And that to me is, I think, a very interesting presentation of the fall and original sin, which I'm not exactly sure whether Christians would find comfortable with or not comfortable with. So perhaps before, there's a few ideas I've just talked about, I suppose, about the human in relation to the race and the individual, and also the idea of original sin as presented in Kierkegaard. How would you view those two ideas, and how would you put them next to each other?
Okay, I think I would like to begin by analyzing this key quote that I think is quite relevant to your point. The race has its history. Within it, sinfulness has its continual, quantitatively measurable identity. But innocence is always lost solely through the individual's qualitative leap. That this sinfulness, which is the progress of the human race, may appear as a greater or a lesser disposition in the particular individual who assumes in its intention is indeed true, but this is more or less a quantitative identification, which does not constitute the concept of guilt. So, very interestingly enough, he makes that distinction between the individual and the universal. The idea of the race as a whole having history. But the race's history, what maybe you might call more Augustinian classical understanding of original sin, of the seminal transference from father to son. Rather, it is within that history, within that race, the sinfulness is always able to be measured within a person. But here's the sort of kicker, right? We have another idea that innocence is ignorance. So that when humans grow up and gain that knowledge, or just by the very virtue of having that knowledge of sin that Adam had brought on also to us all, this is, I guess, the sort of way that we might reconcile this with the idea of our more dogmatic understanding of sin, original sin. But it is the individual who always loses it. It is the individual who is always experiencing that sense of anxiety. This anxiety, which you might call the demonic anxiety, the anxiety about the good, and the more sensible anxiety, the anxiety about the evil. We also should make a distinction as well between subjective and objective anxiety too. So when we think about how we feel subjectively anxiety of our sort of position in the world at the moment, and how the race as a whole suffers from this state of anxiety. So yeah, we have to talk about anxiety in relation to the subject, the individual, that thing that causes the loss of innocence, the thing that provides us that ability to choose otherwise, that freedom, that dizziness, and the overall anxiety that's faced by the human race through Adam's sin and through sin in general.
I think that's an interesting kind of perception into a few of the different ideas, and I suppose it starts off always with the idea of that kind of original sin and the angst which occurs, and the different types of angst that I suppose get presented. The demonic form, which is the angst of the good almost. There's the angst of the evil, and there's also this innocence, that this angst and innocence. And I suppose in each of those situations, perhaps one of the areas where I'm not so sure whether I agree with Kierkegaard is this idea that the angst is the greatest when one is perhaps the least connected to the soul, or at least one's awareness. And almost there is some sense of idea that in Kierkegaard, where that angst, perhaps original angst at least, seems at least in the reading that I most recently had, seems to decrease over time as one grows up. I suppose in some sense it appears to me at least that angst increases over time. And I'm not sure what your thoughts are about that, or whether there's potential areas where I might be misreading Kierkegaard in some aspects.
I think I agree with you. I think the position that Hofniensis is presenting is that, yeah, anxiety increases over a person's life. Now, I can understand that with respect to like the more choices that you make, and maybe the closer that you sort of understand your own mortality. But I don't know if I'd call that angst. I think it's far more interesting to consider as despair. So I think if we put concept of anxiety next to sickness and to death, and we have this conversation, imagine the conversation between the author here, Vigilius Hofniensis, and the author there, Anticlimacus. Like, I think the discussion between them would be that, well, I think I agree. I don't think anxiety persists over human life, especially as one becomes more educated and one like understands like which decision might be right to make. Rather, I think as people become less aware of the moment, the sort of individual parts of this individual leap, even of faith, of anxiety, of angst and dread. Once people sort of move away from the moment and start trying to analyze the general nature of this, it becomes less. Fitting to call it anxiety, and much more fitting to call it something else, I think.
Yes, and perhaps this is where the idea of dread comes in, and the translation of dread arises, because I suppose dread does tie into, I suppose, what one might consider the proper understanding, which increases over time. There almost is this idea of of a lack of the English vernacular to be able to present the idea of what increases over time in contrast to what decreases over time. Because I think you're definitely right when you're pointing out the idea that it is the case that a certain feeling that one has as a child is decreasing over time, yet at the same time there is likewise, I suppose, a feeling which is increasing over time. And I'm not sure whether those distinctions can purely be distinct into the few types of dread that is being presented, or different perspectives of dread that is being presented in the concept of angst, or whether it is two very similar but completely different ideas entirely, I suppose. In some sense, that as you're growing older, the more you recognize the moral responsibilities to other people and what's around you, you get into a position where what that feeling which is growing is almost like the Christian idea of bearing one's cross. The cross that you carry becomes heavier over time. And while it's almost indistinguishable from angst, I would say there also seems to be a fundamental difference between the two, whereas one is a willful and knowing understanding of the increase of burden and responsibility, one which is taken with freedom and willingness, whereas in the other hand, there is, I suppose, the angst which comes from the lack of the choice, or at least the lack of the knowing of what one meant to do, which is perhaps the angst which is talked about before Adam and Eve takes the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, is that angst of, I genuinely just do not know what is good and evil. I now have that angst to understand what it is. And I suppose that might be a way to represent those two motifs. Do you agree with that representation, or do you think there's some problems or things that can be developed upon it?
I think something that we further developed upon it is to, I think, branch out from Kierkegaard, especially from here now, because I think we sort of reached the limits of Hoffmanns's language. I think maybe there's something more there. Some Kierkegaard scholar might be able to point it out, but I think we're sort of reaching, for our purposes, the limits of our language here, where we have this one form of angst, which is in fact an angst in innocence. Innocence is ignorance. We have another form of angst, which grows in fact due to loss of innocence and loss of ignorance. So it seems to me there's like angst here, angst there, angst everywhere. And this is why I think the key parts of the concept of anxiety have to be understood in a dialectical way. But this means that it's almost up to us to sort of move forward and try and mediate all of these different ideas together. And one way of perhaps thinking about this is to think about the ways that Kierkegaard is trying to look at the notion of dizziness, right? So the very famous line here, probably the most famous quote in this book, anxiety is the dizziness of freedom. So once we have that general idea, I think this is sort of the mediation now, where in any stage of one's sort of existential life, whenever someone's almost about to move from one existential stage to another, when someone's about to find out, like, at that moment, what's the purpose of their life, the feeling that you have that you're able to either fall off, fly, stand still, run away from the cliff, the dizziness that you almost feel from that experience, that is anxiety, that is angst, that is existential angst. And that is what existentialists are trying to grapple with in their life. That's what a lot of the themes in existentialism is about. Like, if we start to think about some like other characters, if we think about good old Sisyphus, right? The idea there is that his anxiety is not gained through freedom, but through imprisonment and absurdity. But that dizziness is still there. Or if we consider someone like, let's say, Ivan Karamazov, his sort of demure intellectualism continues to restrain him, but he is still free to move wherever he wants, and he's still free to follow Alyosha or not in his arguments. And that causes him anxiety. And I think once we start to branch away from Kierkegaard, I think we find that this original concept of dizziness with regards to freedom, with regards to absurdity, with regards to finality or intellectualism or these things which make up a person's life, I think we begin to see more fully what we mean by existential angst.
I think that's definitely the case, and all the examples that you were presenting so far are profound and do represent different responses of perhaps original state which one encounters the world. Of course, there's that great idea of Heidegger, which I like to return to frequently when you're thinking about existentialism, is the idea of the truth as aletheia, which is the uncovering of the darkness around you, I suppose, or the uncovering of the unknown around you. And I suppose a lot of understanding angst is understanding the darkness, whether it is in the restrictions or whether it's in the intellectualism around you. And the more you kind of try to wrestle your way out of the abyss, the more you're trying to perhaps crawl your way out of the darkness around you. The more you try to struggle against the current, perhaps sometimes the more you feel like you're drowning and being pushed behind. And I suppose that's a form of angst which a lot of people may experience. Though I suppose developing on this theme, I would like to run an idea past you, I suppose, and I was talking to a Kierkegaard and Levinas scholar on Monday, actually. The interview wouldn't come out yet, but if you're interested in that, then stay tuned. It's a wonderful interview on Levinas. I'm yet to edit it, but this video will come out before that. However, the discussion I had was on who Emmanuel Levinas was and some of the ideas of Emmanuel Levinas. And one of the ideas that he was talking about was ethics is first philosophy. And what he meant by that was it is your relationship to the other which forms the foundations of your philosophy and your existence. And as a result, responsibility, which is in existential ethics, is fundamental to your understanding of the world. And what I want to touch upon by saying that is to try to, I suppose, wrestle with angst as a potential relation structure or relation of relations, I suppose. And that when one suffers anxiety, the true depth of anxiety comes when you're looking at it from the perspective of your relationship with other people and how you're meant to interact with the many others around you and how you're meant to choose your responsibilities to which other there is around you. And that, I suppose, is a potential way of looking at angst, which I kind of want to run past you. What are your thoughts about that as angst, as kind of a wrestling of relations?
Yeah, so Levinas, that's a really interesting topic you raised there. I was actually reading him just earlier about his concept of evil. But before I get onto that, I would like to talk a little bit about how that might still link to Kierkegaard's idea of the human race versus the human individual, right? The human race has its history, but the individual understands that within it. So the individual falls through anxiety, through that leap, and through that loss of innocence within the human race because they are still aware of those other human beings. So there's that interesting part in Kierkegaard, but even more so, let's think about what Levinas talks about evil, right? Evil only exists as an excess of trying to attack or consume being. So why is it the case that Auschwitz represented the most horrific thing ever? Why is it evil? Why can we call that in particular evil? And he uses even a very particular way here. It is because the suffering in those chambers occurred because of its complete attack, a monstrous and horrific attack on being, on existence, on these human lives, a complete disregard of the relationship that you should have to your fellow human being. Now, if we imagine the angst here, if we imagine those people in the situations who had the opportunity to do otherwise, the freedom to do otherwise. So if we have like a German guard, for example, the feeling there of angst arises because of that relation of relations, as he just said, right? So we have the initial relation, the relationship between the state as a collective and this poor Jewish victim. And you are there in that state of angst where you could either follow the state and do this evil, horrific act, or since you have the opportunity to, help and save the person that the state is persecuting. And I think in this sense, if we consider this sort of view of evil as consuming being, anxiety of evil being demonic, the relationship between the universal and the individual, both Kierkegaard and Levinas, then I think we can have a very good idea of what angst is really starting to come together now, I guess.
I definitely think that's a very interesting way to approach the situation. I suppose kind of mixing, or at least putting two philosophers together, is something which is very important, especially when you're thinking about the framework of philosophy and where they get their influences from. I think having a figure like Kierkegaard next to a figure like Levinas or Dostoevsky or another existentialist thinker is definitely a good way to approach angst. And perhaps to push the idea of angst further, I suppose, into society today, what do you think is the source of angst in society today, and how do we wrestle it? Or at least, if we view angst as one of the fundamental realities of existence, how are the ways in which we are trying to wrestle with that problem, and what are some of the solutions that people are trying to present in response to it?
Oof, that's a very difficult question. Okay, let's first split this up, I guess, into two, like what is the angst of the day? And I think one part of it is definitely the loss of innocence. I think that people are very much obsessed with losing innocence nowadays. There's almost a shame of being innocent of certain facts about the world. Innocence being ignorance, that is, as well, if we agree with Kierkegaard. So I think there's one part of that. There's the sort of continual eating of the apple in this society. I think another part is the sort of thing that people like Franz Kafka sort of observed, the sort of um, reducing of the human spirit and on human beings to cogs in the machine. So we may even criticize late stage capitalism for this. This sort of notion of reducing human beings to commodities and merely just acting without actually making them think about their wider social responsibilities to each other and their existential role about what it means to live their lives. So those two might be two big things I'm thinking of right now. And another thing, I guess, is that we're seeing now a very interesting twofold process occur. I believe there's a sort of massive increase in mental health problems in society, and at the same time, there's a massive increase of a medicalization and an industrialization of mental health industries to help people with that. So one of the things I'm questioning there is what is actually happening with angst in this situation. So like as we said as I said earlier, the sort of idea of generalized anxiety disorder is not something that Kierkegaard is dealing with. I think if we were to present these sorts of terms to him, it would seem very foreign and very weird for him to sort of see this same word that he's using in this sort of medical sterilized context. And I think the sterilization and almost medicalization of these ideas changes our solutions. It means that we are trying to answer these existential problems with a psychological approach. And I think there are parts where, I mean, Kierkegaard himself in this book is trying to do that. And we're evidently seeing the limits to that. Now imagine that, but on a sort of industrialized scale with mind, industries, the government, the state, all being involved in this sort of situation. Now, these are the problems, I think, but I'll be very tentative or very hesitant to present any solutions because, yeah, I don't know if I'm well read enough, nor if I am too boastful enough to present any solutions to these sort of very deep problems in our society at present.
If you've been enjoying this video so far and have found it helpful, please like and subscribe and share it with your friends. If you want to support this channel financially and support our mission, then check out our Patreon in the link below, where you can support our channel there as well. Hope you enjoyed this video, and let's carry on. I think what you touch upon is correct in many senses, and especially in relation to the growing mental health epidemic, I suppose, if one could call it that, is that is that it's just so common around society, and the solutions do not seem to, at least the way we're looking at it right now, we don't seem to be getting anywhere exactly very quickly, and perhaps that could also be a result of our modern mind. We're children of this age, and as a result, we're looking for quick answers to quick solutions to every problem, which may not actually require quick solutions. And sometimes it is best to hold our peace in the difficulty and the temper and the length of the situation. Now, I don't think we'll touch anxiety disorders any further than this, just because I don't think I'm much of a speaker or knowledgeable on this front either. However, something you touched upon as well about Kafka, about reducing people to commodities, perhaps, is part of this angst. And I would like to raise something else about Kafka as well. I think in The Trial, there's this really wonderful passage called Before the Law. And there's basically this guy trying to get access to this door, which is the law, which he can never get access to, and just kind of waits there. And then he kind of dies at the end, or at least goes through ages just waiting for it, and it never really opens. I'm not sure. Does it open at the very end? I don't think it does it? Or does it open and there's nothing on the other side? But essentially, I think there is at the stem of angst almost this longing for justice in society, to whatever justice is, and that might be one of the problems, is that we're longing for things which we cannot define. And perhaps an example of this could potentially be identity politics. I'm not going to go too far into it, but it's almost the idea of let us try to defend or define or look towards, strive towards things which we genuinely don't know much about. And that might be things that is the cause of angst. We desire the law greatly, but we don't even know what the law is that we're desiring. We desire to protect certain rights of people, but we don't really know what the rights of those people are. What even is, I suppose, certain ideas in society, like women's rights. What is a woman, I suppose, and all these things, right? That could also be a stem of angst. We're running towards a certain goal which we want to define, but we cannot define. What's your thoughts on that twist, I suppose?
Once again, it's a sympathetic antipathy and an antipathetic sympathy, right? What you've just presented there is a perfect example of that, right? We want justice, but we don't care enough to really discuss about it. We don't care enough to really discuss about it, but we also want justice. I think there's another factor as well at play, is that there is the solutions, I guess, that you and I share in religiosity and in Christianity in particular. The sort of solutions that provides, I think, are good, and I think provide certain ways for us to understand anxiety and certain ways for us to actually escape, especially the demonic anxiety, right? However, one of the things that is happening as well is the undermining of our sort of religious underpinnings. And what happens with that is a much more, Max Weber called it a disenchanted world, right? And I'm not one to advocate for anti-scientism or a sort of rejection of a continuous process of technology and such. In fact, I think these things can be quite helpful, especially in the future, maybe to help us consider these problems in much more practical ways, I think. But I believe that there's a danger here as well, that in undermining our traditional explanations, or more cynically, ways out, if you will, of the existential crisis, it would only be to the detriment of society and for humanity as a whole.
I think that's definitely a good idea, and something which I suppose is very important and very pressing about the idea of the lack of those values that we used to have, which I suppose were bastions of strength against the problem of I suppose of the unknown and uncertainty, which perhaps stems from angst. And perhaps one more question which came to my mind when you were saying that is, how much do you think the death of God proclamation of Nietzsche in The Gay Science and Zarathustra is a result of angst, or is it a similar strength of emotion but of a completely different source? Would you classify that as angst, or would you classify the madman as perhaps speaking or prophesizing about something of a completely different nature?
I don't think it's angst, because I don't think there is a sort of dizziness in his statement. I think it's more despair, really.
Yes.
If it's angst, he's analyzing in that moment, right? So, like, I think that anxiety is a very short but poignant period in your life when you're making a radical choice. But what Zarathustra is doing there, what's happening in The Gay Science, what Nietzsche's doing there, is he's not acting according to an anxiety about the future, according to a dizziness about the future. No, he seems to be very, very, very distraught about this. It's no sympathetic antipathy. It's a pure and unadulterated antipathy in that statement. The woe and the fear of, like, what comes next, what should we do next after we have killed God? Now, there's another factor, more social factor as well here, is that where does this despair come from? This despair, where is this imbalance, if we want to use Kierkegaard's language, imbalance between the soul and the body sort of come from? Well, it comes from the very mere fact that even in the 1800s, we're starting to see an undermining of our traditional understanding of God. And if we look at the sorts of thinkers happening at the time, so if you think of the liberal thinkers of Germany in Tübingen, so Bauer, Schleiermacher, Reimarus, Hegel as well. If you think about how they try to reconcile Christianity with the increase of modernism, and how they effectively, I think, failed. We can have a talk about that in a more theological episode. What Nietzsche is sort of seeing there is, well, the guys who could have done what I hope to do, the resurrect God, have failed, and it's no longer a matter of, like, anxiety where I don't know what's happening next. He doesn't know what's happening next, but at the same time, it's a despair of what has happened, and there is something that is certain there. So he may be anxious about the future, but I don't think that's the main thing that's being felt there. It's a despair about what's just happened. God is dead. What are we gonna do? What can we do? What buildings? What temples shall we build? What festivals shall we celebrate? What can we do to atone for this great sin?
That's a wonderful analysis, and I hope you've enjoyed this existential podcast. The Existential Talks podcast. I cannot speak anymore, but I hope you've enjoyed this episode. If you enjoyed it and found it fruitful, let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and share it with your friends. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like and subscribe, and go check us out on Patreon. It means a lot to us if you do support our channel, and stay safe. I'll see you soon. Thanks for watching, and goodbye. I'll see you next one.